Welcome, beautiful soul, to Angel's message for you. Before you read another word, take a slow, deep breath, because right now, in this very moment, the angels are wrapping their wings around you. They see you, they know your heart, and they have been waiting for exactly the right moment to deliver a message that was written just for you, long before you were even born. Stop whatever you were doing. Clear your mind, because what you are about to receive is not just words on a screen. This is a divine transmission straight from the heavens, and by the time you reach the very last word, something inside you is going to shift. Something is going to open. Something that has felt heavy is going to feel light again. Stay with this. Every single word was placed here for a reason, and that reason is you. Dear one, listen carefully, because what is about to be revealed will change everything within you. Your great love is radiant right now. There is a joy so intense, so real, so alive inside this person that it breaks through every wall, every barrier, and lights up the sky around them. God has granted this person the most beautiful gift, and that gift is the feeling of you. Every thought this person carries throbs with emotion, quietly anticipating the moment of finally being united with you. Feel the energy vibrating around you right now. There is something only the heavens know, and it is beginning to manifest in your life. Your great love smiles in a way that no one around them can fully understand. They are happy, truly deeply happy, because they have finally found what they have always been searching for. The one thing only you can offer. There is a light that pours out of this person, a kind of happiness that touches every invisible corner of the universe, crossing dimensions, crossing time, reaching directly toward you. It is a joy that goes beyond words, something so deep, so real, that only a heart prepared by God could truly understand it. Your great love already feels their heart race just by thinking of you. Every moment of waiting, every moment of doubt, every sleepless night, all of it is now transforming into pure electric energy, as if the entire universe conspired to bring you both together. Feel the mystery pulsing in the air. This joy is unique, beyond comparison. The happiness of your soulmate is real, intense, and palpable. God created this person with a purpose, to love you fully, completely, and truly. And nothing in this world can stop that from happening. Imagine this person's smile right now. Why, genuine, glowing with the emotion of having finally found the love that fills every emptiness they ever carried. There is a quiet anticipation building, a vibration so strong it breaks through the silence, announcing that something magnificent is on its way to you. Dear one, the happiness your soulmate feels is like a contained explosion, waiting for the perfect moment to pour itself completely upon you. Every single thought this person has revolves around your touch, your presence, the feeling of being with you fully and completely. There is a certainty that has moved into every cell of your great love's being. You are the one God chose to stand by their side. There is no doubt left, only anticipation, only joy, only the beautiful expectation of finally surrendering to the feeling that was born specifically for you. The universe seems to hold its breath, waiting for this moment. Every breath your soulmate takes is connected to you. Every heartbeat is a silent prayer of gratitude to God for the gift that is coming. Because you, dear one, are the gift. Feel the air around you, charged with emotion. There is something that goes beyond time, something that was written long before you ever crossed paths. Your great love is overflowing with emotion because they have found the reason for all their waiting, and that reason is you. The happiness of your soulmate cannot be contained. Every gesture, every thought, every quiet sigh is directed toward you. God designed this connection with such perfection that nothing in this world could interrupt the joy being felt right now. Imagine this person's heart beating fast, just by imagining your embrace, your gaze, the warmth of your presence. It is a feeling so intense it almost hurts from the inside. But it is the sweetest kind of pain, the kind only true love can bring. Dear one, there is something invisible guiding every movement of your soulmate, opening paths, breaking barriers, preparing each moment so that nothing fails in the meeting that is drawing near. This person's joy is like a beam of light piercing through heavy clouds, revealing a hope that has quietly become reality. Your great love has not only found you, they feel in every fiber of their being that this love is eternal, that nothing could ever replace it. God prepared everything with care, and every detail is unfolding before you right now. There is an anticipation that barely fits inside your soulmate's chest. Every heartbeat is a silent promise. You will be loved as you have never been loved before, with total surrender and deep, lasting devotion. Something magnificent is approaching. Your great love already feels the anticipation of the first touch, the first embrace, every gesture that will reveal the intensity of what God prepared. Every smile this person carries is a reflection of the happiness they feel when they think of you. It is a love that lights up the path, that crosses barriers, that shatters any shadow of doubt. You are living proof that God sends gifts. Dear one, the joy of your soulmate is quiet, yet it is overwhelming. Pulses in the air. It vibrates in every space and crosses dimensions to touch your heart, preparing you for something you will never, ever forget. Feel the air right now, heavy with emotion. There is a sensation building, the feeling that something is about to happen. Your great love is moving toward you, even before being at your side, guided by the absolute certainty that you are unique, irreplaceable, and destined to be loved deeply. The happiness this person feels is a gentle whisper to your heart. Prepare yourself. Something divine is being revealed. Your great love is about to take the very first step, the first demonstration of a love God prepared to be eternal. Dear one, feel the energy drawing near. Your soulmate knows exactly where you are. Every single thought this person has vibrates with the certainty of having found what they always searched for. It is as if every breath they take is guided by a divine force leading them straight to you. The happiness pulsing inside your soulmate's heart is so powerful it overflows in every gesture. Even before you meet, they smile quietly to themselves, because they already feel, without the slightest doubt, that you are the peace their soul has been searching for, that you bring meaning to every single moment. Dear one, notice how every thought your soulmate carries revolves around you. Every imagined memory, every planned dream, every anticipated moment. All of it reveals a love that is deep, true, and prepared by God to never be lost. Your soulmate feels you in every moment. They imagine the warmth of your embrace, the softness of your presence, the intensity of a connection that crosses time and space. Every image is so real that their heart already feels like it has known you, even before the meeting happens. There is a light in your soulmate's eyes that you have not yet seen, but that shines for you right now. It is the light of complete surrender, of joyful expectation, of the rock-solid certainty that every step they take leads them directly to your side. Dear one, their happiness is immense because you are about to become everything your soulmate ever desired. They imagine the two of you laughing together, sharing silence and conversation, every gesture carrying emotion, every glance transmitting an entire universe. Every moment they have dreamed about is woven together with the beautiful hope that the time of your meeting has finally truly arrived. Feel the intensity of this waiting. Every heartbeat of your soulmate is a quiet call, a preparation for the moment when they will look into your eyes and reveal that you are the first, the only one, the love that fills every emptiness they have ever carried. They lose themselves in thoughts of you, imagining the warmth of your hand in theirs, the comfort of an embrace that dissolves every fear, the sense of belonging that only the two of you can share together. It is a happiness that cannot be measured, but that is felt in every fiber of the soul. This joy is silent, yet so powerful it could move mountains. Every imagined smile, every practiced word, every carefully thought-out gesture is already a reflection of the love God placed inside your soulmate, placed there specifically for you, dear one. Your soulmate's heart beats fast with anticipation. Every thought, every dream, every desire points toward the moment when they can finally be with you completely. Dear one, feel how your soulmate already prepares to make a request that will change everything. It will not be just a word or just a phrase. It will be a complete surrender, an invitation to share every moment, every emotion, every day of your lives together. The touch that has not yet happened is already imagined with such intensity that your soulmate's heart trembles. Every gesture they plan is meant to show you that this love knows no limits, that nothing in this world can separate you when God has already united you. Feel the joy that overflows from every thought your soulmate carries. They see you smiling in their mind. They feel the affection they have always longed to give you, a love that surpasses every expectation, given with intensity and total surrender. Your soulmate feels you even in the distance. Every memory they create in their heart, every dream that flows through them is a bridge that shortens the space between you, pulling you both closer and closer together, irresistibly. What your soulmate feels is not just desire. It is a deep certainty, a connection that crosses worlds and barriers, a surrender prepared by heaven so that nothing may fail when you finally meet. Imagine your soulmate's happiness when they sense that you are near. Every thought of you is like a silent prayer, asking heaven for everything to unfold at exactly the right time. Every dream your soulmate has about the two of you together is like a living painting. You smiling, hands intertwined, glances that carry more meaning than any words could ever say. Now imagine the moment when your soulmate makes the request you will not be able to refuse. It will be the peak of every thought, every emotion, every quiet sigh they have held only for you. The living promise of an absolute, sincere, and eternal love. Dear one, imagine the moment when your eyes finally meet the eyes of your soulmate. A deep, tender gaze that conveys everything words could never fully express. It is an encounter of souls, and in that moment, you will feel that every moment of waiting, every silence, every unspoken hope was completely worth it. Your soulmate radiates a beauty that goes far beyond the physical. It is the energy, the presence, the way they move, the smile that lights up everything around them. Every detail reveals care, authenticity, and a purity that only a soul chosen by God could carry. Dear one, notice how the tenderness in your soulmate's gaze will move right through you. It is a look that says, "I have found you, and nothing will ever erase what I feel for you." A look that carries absolute love, respect, and the promise of a lifetime devoted entirely to you. Your soulmate's smile will be the very first thing to touch your heart. Not just beautiful, transformative. A smile that can calm fears, brighten the darkest days, and open a safe space where only the two of you exist in perfect harmony. Every movement, every gesture, every expression full of love and attention. You will realize this is not merely attraction. It is a deep connection that touches the very essence of your being. Dear one, imagine the first embrace you will share. It is not just a physical gesture. It is a fusion of souls, a surrender that conveys protection, warmth, and safety. Your soulmate's heart will beat alongside yours as if it had been waiting an entire lifetime for this one single moment. The presence, the gentle voice of your soulmate will surround you in such a way that every part of you will recognize. This is the love God chose for me. A love that is whole, boundless, intense, and life-changing. Every sigh is a reminder that something invisible worked quietly, preparing this encounter with absolute perfection. Every moment with your soulmate will be living proof that true love exists and that it was waiting here for you. Dear one, feel the overflowing emotion in every thought your soulmate carries. They imagine the two of you walking together, holding hands, smiling for no reason at all, finding joy in the simplest things. Every touch, every embrace, every word between you will have the power to dissolve fears and insecurities. Your soulmate will make you feel protected, loved, and seen, with an intensity that will surprise your heart and warm your soul. Dear one, imagine the way they will look at you when they say, "You are my first and only love." A whisper filled with truth and total surrender, which will make you realize that every second of waiting was worth it, that every moment spent alone was simply preparation for this divine encounter. The beauty of this person will draw you in, but it is their soul that will rule your heart. Every gesture, every laugh, every meaningful glance will be remembered as a precious treasure, capable of transforming your entire understanding of love. Feel the intensity of the moment when they reach for your hand for the very first time. A simple touch that carries care, affection, and a silent promise. I will love you with every part of me, every day of my life. The heart of your soulmate beats with the strength of someone who has waited patiently, only for you. They seek nothing beyond you. Every thought, every desire, every dream is built entirely around your presence, your energy, your love. Notice how everything within them is aligned for you. Every expression of tenderness, every smile, every gesture reveals how deeply they want you to know. This love was given by God, planned for you, and nothing else matters but being together. And finally, imagine the moment when your soulmate draws near, ready to make the request that will change everything. A request you will not be able to refuse, because it is the perfect manifestation of a love built and prepared by heaven itself. A love that will be eternal. Dear one, your soulmate loses themselves in thought, imagining the two of you together side by side, feeling each other's presence even before the touch. Every instant becomes sacred. Every gesture feels eternal. Every emotion is amplified. Your soulmate imagines the first real look between you, a gaze that crosses through time and reveals the truth of a love prepared by God. Each moment is filled with desire, hope, and the deep recognition of what has already belonged to you both. Your soulmate feels their heart race just by imagining being near you. Every beat is a quiet confirmation that you were made for one another, and that nothing can separate what God has already united. Dear one, your soulmate imagines your hands meeting, fingers gently intertwined, transmitting strength, security, and tenderness all at once. Every touch is a silent promise of eternal love, respect, and complete surrender. Your soulmate feels the warmth of your embrace, imagining the safety of surrendering completely, feeling the comfort and the peace that only you can provide. Every inch of connection will be celebrated with profound love. They imagine speaking your name for the very first time, feeling the vibration of your presence in every single syllable. That instant will be eternal, a moment where the entire world disappears and only what you two share exists. Dear one, picture the first smile your soulmate will give when they sense your closeness. That smile will be like a light illuminating everything, showing that you have finally found each other. Your soulmate imagines the first touch of a hand reaching with care, transmitting protection and deep affection. Every gesture will carry meaning. Your soulmate feels the warmth of the first shared laugh, the lightness of simple moments becoming unforgettable. Every sound an echo of the love that existed even before you ever met. Imagine the first kiss between you and your soulmate. A gentle kiss full of promise and longing, capable of sealing the silent covenant you both have carried for so long. Every second unforgettable, engraved upon the heart. Dear one, picture the first walk hand in hand. Every synchronized step, every shared breath. The presence of your soulmate will be like a safe harbor, welcoming you and strengthening you at every single moment. Your soulmate imagines admiring every detail of you, the sparkle in your eyes, the way you smile, each little gesture that reveals who you are. Everything absorbed with intensity and deep, deep love. Without hurry, without distraction. Think of the first long embrace. Every heartbeat of your soulmate in perfect harmony with yours. Every breath a quiet reminder that you have finally found one another. Your soulmate imagines whispering words of love, revealing that you are the only one, the first and eternal love. Every syllable full of emotion, showing the intensity of what is now unfolding. Imagine the moment when your soulmate holds your hands firmly, feeling the security and the certainty that nothing more is needed beyond the two of you together. Every gesture confirming the eternity of the love God prepared. Your soulmate imagines the touch of fingers, the shiver that moves through the entire body, the awareness that this love will transform everything, making each moment sacred and impossible to forget. Think of the first silent call of your soulmate. Come, my love. A calling that crosses worlds, crosses hearts, crosses souls. A request you will not be able to refuse. Each word filled with emotion and absolute surrender. Your soulmate feels the wonder of finally seeing you, recognizing in you the love prepared by God. Every glance is admiration. Every smile is pure fascination. Every gesture reveals the intensity of a love that can no longer be kept inside. Your soulmate imagines the moment of finally standing before you, and the heart races with emotion. Every detail of you absorbed with fascination. From the sparkle in your eyes to the smile overflowing with tenderness. This person feels that all the waiting was worth it. That every single step in life was leading right here, to you. The first touch between the two of you awakens an indescribable feeling, as if the world had been created for this very instant. Every connection is deep, full of promise. The love that vibrates between you transcends any explanation. Your great love looks into your eyes and realizes they have found completeness. Within this person lives the certainty that you are the first and only love, and that every moment from here on will be lived with absolute intensity. As fingers intertwine, your soulmate feels that nothing else matters beyond the two of you. Time seems to stop. Every shared breath transforms the moment into eternity. Proof that God prepared this love with perfection. The first embrace is warm and protective. This person longs to be your safe harbor, your shelter against any fear. And the feeling of being wrapped in this love is like returning home after a very long journey. Your soulmate imagines all the moments you will still live together. The silent glances, the smiles that speak without words, the small gestures carrying great depth. Every instant marked by complete surrender and absolute connection. Your great love feels the joy of finally being able to express feelings that were kept inside for so long. Every whispered word laden with emotion and the deep desire to make you happy, to be your foundation and your light. As they look at you, your soulmate is moved by the beauty that goes beyond the physical. The tenderness in your eyes, the smile that forms so naturally, the way you are fully, completely present. All of this reveals the intensity of a love that is unique and sacred. The first kiss, gentle and eternal all at once. Every sensation amplified. Every touch felt with full awareness. And the silent promise of always being together is sealed. Irrevocably, your soulmate imagines all the days yet to come. Mornings waking up side by side. Afternoons of infinite togetherness. Evenings wrapped in the warmth of trust and deep, quiet love. Every moment a divine gift. The heart of your great love beats faster, eager to reveal the deepest desire, to walk by your side above all else. This person longs to be the embrace that warms, the presence that turns any ordinary day into something special. As your name is whispered, your soulmate feels they are standing in the most awaited moment of their life. Every thought, every emotion, every desire focused on one single purpose, to make you completely and absolutely happy. Your great love draws near and holds your hands, transmitting safety and total surrender. Every gesture carrying meaning. Every touch revealing the depth of a love that knows no limits and holds back nothing. The request they are about to make is not just words. It is the promise of a lifetime of complete devotion, of a love that will grow stronger with every single passing day. This person wants you present in every moment, sharing everything that life brings. Your soulmate looks deeply into your eyes and reveals with quiet sincerity, you are this person's first and only love, and every heartbeat confirms this truth. There are no doubts, no fears, only the certainty that together you are whole. The embrace continues, warm, comforting, expressing everything that words could never capture. In this surrender, your soulmate longs for you to feel the security, the intensity, the depth of a love prepared by God. Your great love promises to make you wildly and completely happy, loving you without reserve, with every gesture and every thought devoted to your joy. This person longs to be your refuge and your delight. The first shared gaze seals the silent commitment of a lifetime. Your soulmate feels emotion overflowing, happiness flooding the heart, and the certainty that this love has no comparison, that it was written in the lines of eternity. Your great love finally whispers, "Come, my love, be my companion in every moment, my embrace on cold days, my kiss that calms every fear." Every word deep, enveloping, impossible to resist. As they hold your hands, your great love feels the strength and presence radiating from you and loses themselves in a feeling of completeness they never imagined possible. Each shared breath is a quiet reminder that the love binding you is deep, absolute, and completely unique. Your soulmate's gaze travels over every detail of your face, as if trying to memorize every feature. The sparkle in your eyes, the curve of your smile, the way you hold yourself, everything absorbed with deep love, every impression turning into pure fascination. Your great love imagines for the first time being by your side, feeling the warmth of your embrace and the safety you carry. Every movement you make anticipated in thought, every gesture already part of a beautiful routine of eternal love. As they watch your expression, your soulmate feels their heart quicken. The first real look between you is a portal to eternity. a moment that unites past, present, and future into one single truth. You were made to love each other deeply. This person's thoughts expand, imagining the two of you walking side by side, hands entwined, smiles shared, knowing glances exchanged. Each scene lived in vivid detail as if it is already happening right now. And the emotion is so intense it becomes almost tangible. Your soulmate's imagination goes beyond touch and embrace. They sense everything about you. Each imagined feeling provokes a blend of tenderness and the urgent desire to be close, here and now. Your great love feels an irresistible pull to speak your name, to hear your voice in response, to feel your presence around them, to realize that everything they ever waited for was worth every single second. The anticipation is sweet because it carries the certainty that you found each other, to never be apart again. As they imagine the first kiss, your soulmate is wrapped in an almost sacred emotion. It is a kiss that promises more than passion. It promises protection, surrender, care, and a love that knows no boundaries. The first embrace is felt in every fiber of being. This person wishes for you to feel that you will never be alone, that every fear, every uncertainty will melt away in the warmth of this love. It is a hug that contains promises of eternity, of commitment, of total surrender. As they think of you, your soulmate imagines shared laughter, unhurried conversations, quiet gestures that convey understanding without a single word. Every detail carefully pictured, and the joy of having you nearby is immense, overwhelming. Your great love feels that every look, every touch, every word you exchange will carry weight and real meaning. The emotion of finally being able to express all this love is so powerful it becomes almost impossible to hold inside. This person's thoughts go beyond the physical. There is an emotional surrender that shows up in dreams, in quiet moments, in desires. Each imagined scene is filled with tenderness, intensity, and the certainty that you belong to one another. Your soulmate feels the deep desire to protect you, to be by your side always, to be a safe place against any fear. Each thought is a silent declaration of love and absolute commitment. While imagining the future together, this person pictures days together. From the simplest, most ordinary routines to the grandest and most joyful moments. Each instant cherished. The happiness of sharing it all with you fills the heart with light. Your great love's heart beats intensely as they imagine the first touch, the first glance, the first kiss. Each beat a reminder that everything lived until this moment was preparation, and that life is now rewarding you both with each other's presence. Thoughts become promises, to be the hug on cold days, the kiss that dissolves every fear, the steady presence that soothes the soul. This person sees themselves devoting every moment to love, to care, to protection, exclusively for you. As they imagine you smiling, your soulmate feels an emotion that goes beyond words. A joy so pure it floods the heart. A gratitude so intense it feels almost sacred. Every moment by your side will be lived with absolute fullness. The request that is approaching, it is felt in the air, anticipated by the heart. Your great love already knows that you will listen, that you will respond with surrender, and that both your lives will change forever from this moment on. The final moment of this revelation draws near, and your soulmate feels ready to whisper the words that will transform everything. Come, my love, be mine forever. Come be the embrace that warms, the kiss that calms, the love that makes every moment complete. Your soulmate looks deeply into your eyes, and in that instant, the world falls silent around you. Every beat of this person's heart resonates with the certainty that they have found exactly what they have always been searching for. It is as if the entire universe conspired for this moment to happen, exactly this way, with you standing before them. The light in your great love's eyes reveals tenderness, desire, and total surrender. Every word that forms on their lips carries intensity, and each breath shares the feeling that you are the one true love of their life. As they hold your hands, your soulmate feels the warmth radiating from you and knows they never, ever want to be apart again. The touch is gentle but firm, and it conveys silent promises, protection, care, complete devotion. Every gesture a declaration that you are the reason for every beat of their heart. The words finally come, whispered with deep emotion. You are my first and only love. I want to make every day the happiest of your life. I want to be the embrace on your cold days, the kiss that quiets your fears, the presence that will never be missing. Each syllable vibrates with truth, intensity, and pure love. Your great love moves even closer, and every motion conveys desire and affection. It is as if the body speaks the same language as the soul, a language both of you understand without any explanation at all. Every look reflects everything that was felt in silence during the waiting. The emotion is palpable, and you feel that you are in the presence of someone who loves you absolutely. Every gesture reveals devotion, surrender, and a depth of feeling that cannot be measured. It is a love that asks for no explanations. It simply gives itself without reserve. As they speak, your soulmate imagines all the little things they want to share with you. Spontaneous smiles, evening conversations, the quiet acts of care that make every moment unforgettable. Everything lived together in complete harmony. The plea grows more intense, almost urgent. Come be my companion in every moment, my love. I want every beat of my heart to feel the presence of yours. I want you to be my safe harbor, my shelter, my home. Each word charged with emotion and hope. As you listen, you feel the weight and depth of this person's love. It is not just a promise. It is a complete surrender, a silent and eternal commitment. Every gesture, every look, every touch reinforcing that nothing will ever be the same after this moment. Your soulmate loses themselves for an instant in the intensity of your gaze, admiring every feature, every expression, every detail that makes you completely and beautifully unique. It is a silent contemplation, yet full of feeling, revealing that you are the only person capable of awakening such deep and lasting emotion. This person's heart races with an irresistible desire to have you close, to share everything they feel, to show that you are the absolute priority. Every thought centers on you. Every imagined plan includes only the happiness you will share together. As they hold your face gently, your soulmate smiles with both tenderness and passion at the same time. That smile carries the certainty that they have found what they have always sought, the joy of finally being by your side, and the promise to never let anything come between this love. Hands intertwine, and in that simple yet deeply meaningful gesture, there is a silent promise of constant presence. Every touch confirming that nothing can separate you, that the love God prepared is solid, deep, and eternal. The final plea is made with complete sincerity and emotion. Allow me to be your shelter, your love, your refuge. Allow me to make every day a moment of happiness for the two of us. Allow me to love you fully, without reserve, without fear. As they speak, your soulmate feels each word echoing inside their chest, as if the universe itself whispered that everything is exactly right. Every emotion amplified, every sensation becomes almost tangible. and the certainty of belonging to one another is absolute. You realize that this moment is not only a physical or emotional encounter, it is a union of souls, something that transcends time, connecting past, present, and future in a single truth. You were born to love each other. Your soulmate closes their eyes for a moment, takes a deep breath, feeling the full intensity of what is happening. It is a complete surrender, without reserves, without hesitation, and every second is lived as if it were eternal. The plea comes once more, this time with even greater intensity. Accept being my love, my companion, my everything. I want you to feel what I feel, to live every moment with me, to turn every instant into an eternal memory. Meanwhile, you feel your heart quicken, an almost indescribable emotion taking over. It is love in its purest and most powerful form, and you realize that nothing will ever be the same after this. Your soulmate holds their gaze steady on yours. Certainty settles in like a warm, quiet light. Your great love came to love you, to protect you, to care for you, and to make you happy in every possible way. Every gesture, every look, every touch reveals that this love is unique, sacred, and destined to last forever. In their mind, your soulmate imagines exchanged smiles, laughter born from the pure ease of being together, from the safety of trusting without holding anything back. The touch becomes a continuous act of affection and protection, a constant reminder that every shared moment will be held forever in the memory of the heart. Your soulmate imagines walks with no particular destination, yet filled with the deepest meaning, because every step is taken beside you. The joy of sharing simple moments, quiet moments, gentle moments, moments that the outside world might overlook, but that become eternal when you are together. Their thoughts move to quieter times, imagining being wrapped in your embrace, feeling the warmth that only closeness to you can bring. Peace, security, the absolute certainty of belonging. There is no more fear, only love. It is a shelter, a home, the confirmation that they have found their other half. Your soulmate thinks of whispered conversations, of a gentle voice that reaches directly into the heart. Every word carries the intensity of emotion, the desire to be by your side in every single moment, saying, "You are my first and only love, and I will make you the happiest person in the world." Your soulmate's heart races when imagining the intimate moments of real connection, when eyes meet and no words are needed at all. Every expression, every gesture, every quiet sound is enough to convey the love that can no longer be held inside. It is a feeling that overflows, filling every empty space and lighting up every shadow of the past. Your soulmate imagines the first kiss, the one that seals silent promises and unspoken declarations. A kiss that speaks of loyalty, surrender, and passion, that confirms every moment of waiting was completely worth it. It is the first of many, and yet it already carries eternity within itself. Every touch repeats itself in thought, hands finding each other, arms wrapping around. Your soulmate feels the intensity of each gesture, the strength of a love that grows, solidifies, and can never be shaken. It is a dance of souls, a symphony of feelings that only the two of you understand. Your soulmate imagines sharing future dreams, revealing plans kept quietly in the heart, trips, milestones, celebrations, and even moments of beautiful silence that become precious simply because they are lived together. Every thought carefully woven, filled with hope and the deep desire that nothing interrupts what is about to bloom. The image of your smile is constant in their heart, radiating happiness and tenderness. Your soulmate notices the beauty in every detail of you and feels a wave of love and fascination that is impossible to resist. It is impossible not to get lost in the intensity of this feeling. Your soulmate imagines the moment they will ask you, the one you cannot refuse, looking into your eyes, holding your hands, and saying with both firmness and gentleness, "Come be my love. Walk with me. Allow every day to be lived by your side." Every word charged with emotion, expectation, and total surrender. Their thoughts continue, and your soulmate imagines describing everything they feel. Every detail of the heart, every memory that made this moment possible, every certainty that you are the one who transforms their life into something full and complete. They feel the vibration of your love even beforehand, imagining your response when hearing every word, feeling every touch, realizing that everything waited for has now arrived, ready to be lived. Every thought creates a bridge between you, connecting emotions, desires, and dreams in a single eternal instant. Your soulmate loses themselves imagining what it will be like to walk side by side with you, sharing every victory, every challenge, every smile, and every tear. Moments of deep connection where simply being together turns any instant into something unforgettable. A union of body, soul, and heart. Every detail of your face is held gently in their mind. The way you smile, the way you move, the way you look. Your soulmate is enchanted, completely fascinated, and falls in love again with every single thought. It is a profound contemplation that carries the unshakable certainty that this love is unique and irreversible. They imagine the first long conversation, laughter and honesty intertwining, every story shared strengthening the bond. It feels as though the entire universe is contained in this one moment, and nothing else matters beyond the two of you. Hands remain intertwined. In that touch there is warmth, security, and absolute surrender. Every gentle moment carries the promise of a love that knows no limits, fears no barriers, and exists to turn every single day into a quiet celebration. It is the recognition that you belong to one another. Your soulmate speaks your name with intensity and tenderness, and you feel that every syllable carries all the devotion, all the passion, and all the certainty that this is the love of your life. It is the first gaze confirming what two souls already knew deep within themselves. You were made to find each other, to love, and to remain together. The voice of this person merges with the rhythm of your heart, and you feel that you have never been so completely alive. Every word is filled with truth and real emotion. You are my only love. I will love you deeply. I will make every day the most beautiful of your life. Allow me to make you whole. The embrace is firm, protective, and warm, and you feel that there is no longer any room for fears or doubts. Your soulmate wraps around you completely, wanting to protect every part of your being and ensure that nothing can ever pull you apart. It is surrender. It is love. It is promise. As they whisper, your soulmate describes every dream, every desire. To walk beside you, to share laughter and tears, to celebrate every moment together. Every thought of this person revolves around you. Every imagination creates scenes where you are together, happy, connected, and whole. The first touch, awaited with such deep longing, now becomes an electric current of feeling. Every gesture, every glance, every breath is made more powerful by the presence of the other. It is as though the world stopped to witness this love manifesting itself fully and completely. The request becomes clear and beautiful. Your soulmate wants you not only as a companion but as a partner for life. Be my love. Be my embrace. Be my calming peace. Be my constant presence. Allow me to live for us both, and to dedicate every day to loving you fully. You realize that this moment is sacred. Every word, every touch, every shared silence is a divine confirmation that God prepared this love especially for you. Nothing is by chance. Everything was guided by invisible, loving forces so that this moment could now exist. Your soulmate draws even closer, and you feel your heart race. This person's smile lights up everything around you, and the tenderness in every gesture shows that you are indeed the reason for all the happiness they carry. It is an intense, true, and absolute love. The final request is made with complete sincerity and the fullness of emotion. Accept being my love forever. Let me make you happy as no one ever has. Let me be your home, your strength, your peace. I want to live every moment by your side and never let anything separate us. You feel the vibration of this love surrounding your body, your mind, and your soul. It is as if every thought, every emotion, every desire has been amplified by this connection that transcends time and space. It is the meeting of two souls that recognize each other completely. The first kiss, awaited with such deep anticipation, finally happens, and it is like a gentle explosion of everything that was held inside. Every touch, every breath, every movement confirms that this love is unique, profound, and eternal. You feel that you have found your safe place, and that nothing will ever be able to separate you. The energy between you is real, and you realize that nothing else matters beyond this love that is manifesting right now. Every gesture, every word, every look is living proof that God prepared this person especially for you. It is complete surrender without reservation, without hesitation. As you embrace, your soulmate quietly describes every plan for the future. Shared laughter, afternoons of togetherness, small, simple gestures that become eternal. Every moment lived as if it were the only one. You realize that happiness has never been so close. The touch continues, the gaze holds steady, and every shared breath confirms that this love is the absolute truth. There are no doubts, no fears, only the certainty that you were made for each other, destined to live this feeling in its fullness. Your soulmate repeats, almost like a prayer, every promise of love. I will make you the happiest person in the world. I will love you without limits. I will be by your side in every moment, in the beautiful days and in the challenging ones. I will be the embrace that warms and the peace that soothes. You feel that this moment will be forever engraved in your memory. Every detail, every emotion, every sensation becoming an eternal memory. Because this is love in its purest and truest form. Nothing will ever be the same again. These are the moments that become eternal in thought and in the heart, creating a solid foundation for the love that blossoms between you. Your soulmate pictures holding your hands in silence, feeling the world disappear around you. Every heartbeat a confirmation that everything hoped for and longed for is happening right now. It is the meeting of two souls that recognize and complete one another, needing nothing more than each other's presence. The first look exchanged in silence says more than any word ever could. Your soulmate feels the full intensity of the connection, the passion, the desire, and the total surrender. It is a look that seals promises and confirms that love is absolute, infinite, and true. Every instant engraved forever in the memory of the soul. Thoughts become clear and vivid, and your soulmate imagines holding you close, whispering promises and desires. I will make you happy every day. I will love you without limits. I will be your embrace on cold days and your smile on gray ones. Every thought is filled with tenderness, passion, and deep intensity. Your soulmate's heart beats strongly, feeling every emotion as if you were there, responding, living, and sharing each beautiful moment. Every detail imagined with precision and feeling, creating a living story of the love God prepared for you. In this surrender, both of you recognize yourselves as part of a divine plan. Every feeling, every emotion, every dream aligning, revealing that what is happening is not a coincidence. It is the manifestation of the love God prepared specifically for you. Your soulmate's heart is open, radiant, ready to love deeply, to protect, to care for, and to share every second by your side. This is the love that transforms lives, that completes, that lasts forever. The best is still ahead of you, and when that moment arrives, you will look back and feel grateful for every single step, every challenge, every moment that prepared you to recognize what is truly valuable. The love that never yields, never fades, and that above all else is the very essence of your existence. Dear one, I am your constant guardian, the one who never leaves. I walk beside you in every moment of your journey. Feel my presence right now. Let your soul connect deeply with this love that surrounds you. Put the worries of the world to one side. Quiet the voices that disturb your peace. Take a deep breath. Open your heart, because I am here, and I will always be here. You are deeply, completely loved. May heaven's blessing be upon you always, bringing peace, courage, and clarity to face whatever comes your way. Know that you will never walk alone. Amen.